Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Newcastle and Sussex County Property Tax Reassessment Update, presented by Saw Ewing. Today, my colleague and I will discuss the current status of the reassessment process, what's involved in pursuing an appeal, and whether an appeal may make sense for your property. My name is Pam Scott. I'm a partner at the law firm of Saul Ewing in their real estate practice group in the Wilmington office. I have with me today my esteemed colleague, Richard Forston, also a partner in Saul Ewing's real estate practice group in the Wilmington office.
I don't know about the word esteemed, but okay.
Just go with it. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping announcements. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. While we would do our best to answer questions submitted during the webinar, should we tend to run over in terms of time, we will certainly follow up individually via email. Also, in the next few days, you will receive a follow-up email that will include links to the webinar recording as well as the supplemental presentation materials. And because we're a law firm, I need to make this legal disclaimer. The provision and receipt of the information in this program is not legal advice, does not create a lawyer-client relationship, and should not be acted on without seeking professional counsel who have been informed of the specific facts. Also, I will note at the bottom of your screen, there is a resources button that would take you to a link to our bios as well as other resources associated with this webinar. So with that, we're going to get started.
You gotta tell them to.
Do you want to pull up the PowerPoint, please? Thank you. And next slide, please. So again, it's Richard Forston and Pam Scott. And there's a little bit of information about us, but again, there is a link to our bio in the resources tab at the bottom of your screen. So next slide, please. If you remember nothing else from today's seminar, please remember that in Newcastle County, the deadline to file an assessment appeal is March 14th. And it's March 14th by 4 p.m. If they do not receive it by that time frame, they will consider the appeal to not have been filed. In Sussex County, they have actually begun accepting appeals already as of February 25th, but the deadline to submit something is March 31st. Next slide, please.
So one of the questions that people ask a lot is why reassessment now? And it relates back to a lawsuit that got filed shortly before COVID started, in which Delawareans for Educational Opportunity and the state NAACP sued the state of Delaware and the 3 counties, claiming that Delaware was not providing enough proper education or not providing sufficient educational resources for certain student groups, and that the 3 counties, because they had been using assessment values from years and years and years ago. In the case of Newcastle County, your assessment for this year and for the last 42 years has been based on the fair market value of the property as of July 1, 1983. In Sussex County, it was July 1, 1974. And, properties appreciate at different rates. And so the county, the plaintiffs in that case claimed that Delaware was violating property tax assessment requirements. In May of 2020, the Chancery Court agreed and ordered all 3 of the counties to do reassessments. And so Kent County's reassessment took effect last summer, July 1, 2024, and they use a July 1, 2023 fair market value. Newcastle County and Sussex County's reassessments take effect this July 1st. Newcastle County, and there'll be another slide about this, has your assessment is based on the July 1, 2024 fair market value. And in Sussex County, it's based on July 1, 2023, like Kent. And after the court opinion, the General Assembly also adopted certain legislation basically saying that the counties are now going to have to do this reassessment at least once every 5 years. We'll see if that requirement doesn't get changed to maybe every 10 years. Obviously, it's been a very expensive and I'll say somewhat disruptive process the last couple of years. And so we'll see what happens. But right now, after this new reassessment takes effect, this coming July 1st, 2025, both Newcastle and Sussex counties are going to have to do another reassessment to take effect July 1, 2030, et cetera, et cetera. So question whether that ultimately will be followed or perhaps changed, we shall see. Next slide. So as I mentioned, right now, your assessments for this tax year, your assessments for the last 40 plus years, in Newcastle County, it was fair market value as of July 1, 1983. In Sussex County, fair market value as of July 1, 1974. And this was true, you know, if you had a house built and moved into new construction, say in 2000 or 2005 or 2010, the county would estimate what that property's value would have been in July 1, on July 1, 1983. And I will say that by and large, on the residential side of things, you know, residential properties for the most part tend to move in unison. And the county did, I think, a good job, a relatively good job of assessing residential properties. On the commercial industrial side, property values can change dramatically. You know, if you're a shopping center and then another shopping center opens across the street, for example, suddenly, you know, your property may be worth less. Office buildings, the same thing. In fact, there have been some office buildings that were around in 1983 that have been torn down because of changes in the market. The county's valuation of non-residential properties, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It was always a little hit or miss. And I think both counties were somewhat relying on property owners to come in and complain if you thought your assessment, if you thought you were overassessed, come in and talk to them. Well, going forward, it should be a lot easier to determine how accurate your assessment is going to be, at least in the short term, because Newcastle County is going to use July 1, 2024, so less than a year ago, as the fair market value as of that date will be your assessment. Sussex County is going to be July 1, 2023. Next slide.
And just a follow-up question on that, Richard. So for the non-residential properties, did the counties actually try and get kind of, or ask for more, you know, information about these properties, like if it was an office building, whether it was leased and that kind of stuff, or, you know?
So Tyler Technologies was the company that all three counties used to do their reassessments. And at some point, I want to say it was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, maybe, non-residential property owners, shopping centers, office buildings, got a questionnaire from Tyler Technologies, entirely optional if you wanted to send it back or not. And it was asking you about your rent roll and your vacancy rate and your rental rates and your expenses. I mean, all the sort of information that would go into forming an appraisal and determining fair market value. They asked for that information, I'm going to say, not only in connection with the individual property, but also because they were trying to build a model of, I'll say, market rents, market expenses, market vacancies. The response rate, even though the information provided was confidential, the response rate was, I'm told, charitably described as abysmal. And so they didn't get a lot of responses. Can't say I'm surprised about that, but so they had, I'll say, somewhat limited information to build and base their model on. But that's the answer.
Yeah. And so probably some of you have been involved in this, but Tyler did send letters to all property owners in both Newcastle and Sussex counties, basically providing what they determined to be the tentative reassessment value, invited you to then reach out to them, whether in person or also they were doing telephone calls about this so that they could get some more information from the property owners in terms of any additional information the property owners may have had about the property and its valuation. I personally participated in 2 such meetings, which I did not find to be particularly productive. And there was not a lot of follow-up from Tyler either when you would ask them for information. For example, okay, well, what comparables did you use for this, for determining what the value was? It was sort of hit or miss as to whether I actually got a follow-up response from them. But in any event, to now see what your actual final assessed value is, you can go to, in Newcastle County, you can go to Parcel View, type in the address, and you can find the proposed assessment. In Sussex County, they don't have a parcel view per se, but you can pull up property records, you can do a search by address or by name, and find out on the screen what the actual final assessment is in Sussex County. Next slide, please. And just to reemphasize, I can't emphasize enough that the deadline for filing an appeal. So again, in Newcastle County, it is March 14th. In Sussex County, you have until the end of March, March 31st, 2025. Those are hard and fast deadlines. There are no exceptions to them.
And so there's going to be a quiz at the end of this webinar. And the only question we're going to ask is, what are the deadlines? And it's 4 p.m. on March 14th, and I believe also 4 p.m. on March 31st for Sussex. So if you're cramming for the quiz at the end, that's the only thing that we really need you to remember. But having said that, the appeal deadline is March 14th. I mean, don't expect to walk in at 3 o'clock and be able to file your application. There's a little bit of homework you'll have to do to fill it out. Not a lot, but a little bit. There is no filing fee. So, I mean, that's helpful and I think good for folks. But don't wait till the 13th. If you're interested in pursuing an appeal, the sooner you start, the better you do.
Next slide, please.
So one of the questions that we are being asked with some regularity over the last month or two is, should I be filing an appeal? What should I be doing? And so you'll see on the slide, I said you do a cost benefit analysis. I mean, right now, the county is telling folks, Newcastle County now I'm talking about, that the overall assessment base went up about 3.8, 3.75. Let me put it a different way, 380% or 375%, somewhere in that range. I think that number will continue to drift down slightly as more appeals are granted. But let's just say 3.75 is the order of magnitude in Newcastle County. So historically, if you had come to me last year or 5 years ago, last year, and said, hey, I think my property is overassessed by $1 million. The county is assessing me at 11 million. I think it should be 10 million. Should I appeal or not? Basically, the numbers in Newcastle County tell you right now, at least in this example, this is Brandywine School District. For every $1 million of assessed value for your property, you're paying approximately $38,000 in taxes. A little more in the city, less in Appoquinimink, but roughly call it $38,000 per $1 million of assessed value. So the reassessments are supposed to be revenue neutral, meaning that right now, if the rate is on $1 million generates 38,000, then if everybody went up 3.75 times, so that new $1 million of assessed value is now 3,750,000, then the tax on 3,750,000 should also generate $38,000, right? So it's supposed to be revenue neutral in theory. Some people are, your property is appreciated more in value. Some people, your property is appreciated less in value, but roughly speaking, 3.75 or 375%. So if you look at your new assessed values, now let's say when you look at the new assessed, you were assessed at $11 million, and your new assessment is going to be $50 million, and you think $50 million is too much, you think it should only be, say, $40 million. Again, the question is an appeal appropriate? Well, if we take the $38,000 per million of assessed value and divide it by 3.75, that means if this is revenue neutral, every $1 million of assessment now is going to result in a $10,000 so that you would need to say, okay, I can save $10,000 in taxes if I reduce my assessment by $1 million. If I can reduce it by $10 million, I'll save $100,000. So that's kind of a rough approximation based on what we know at the moment as to how much you could save in taxes. And so, if it's going to cost you, you have to hire an appraiser and you have to hire an attorney. If it's going to cost you $20,000 for a $1 million reduction, then it would take 2 years for your savings to equal the cost. Now, if that was a $10 million reduction, then your annual savings would be $100,000, and if it only costs you $20,000 to appeal, well, then there's $80,000 in savings right away, plus $100,000 a year going forward. In Sussex, the tax rates are very low, even compared to Newcastle County, and so you're saving. We're going to have to look at the numbers, but in Sussex, it would have to be an even bigger reduction to perhaps justify the cost. And one of the dirty secrets I'll say about Delaware, we've had these base year things for 40 some years in Newcastle County, but compared to surrounding jurisdictions, our property taxes are pretty low, and so people are, I would say, relatively happy about the taxes in Delaware compared to other jurisdictions. I mean, years ago, we represented Verizon on their property tax appeal for all their outdoor plant and equipment, their telephone poles, their wires. The utilities pay a lot of property taxes. And we actually obtained a very significant reduction for Verizon, $90 million. And I remember talking to Verizon's property tax team, and they're in many jurisdictions, and they've got a number of folks who are dedicated to keeping track of their property taxes and all that sort of stuff. And I remember talking to them at the time saying, this is a really big reduction. And you've been, essentially had this assessment for 30 years. Why has it taken you so long to focus on this? And the answer was because the taxes in Delaware were so low compared to New Jersey, New York, and other states that they were fighting the bigger battles before they ended up fighting in Delaware. So that's a blessing For us here in Delaware, we do have relatively low taxes, but that doesn't mean that we need to pay them if they're too high under this new assessment regime.
And just in terms of talking about everyone wants to know what the new tax rate is going to be. In Newcastle County, in speaking to the folks in their property assessment division, normally they come up with the new tax rate at the end of March. This year, they're thinking it's going to be taking them a little bit longer. So they're looking at probably mid-April before they will have determined what the new tax rate is. And by statute, the school districts do not need to determine what the tax rate is until mid-July. So they have a little bit more. And of course, the bulk of your tax bill is based on the school taxes and not on what the counties actually charge. Did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, sure. So in one of my other jobs, or perhaps one of my hobbies, I am president of the Appoquinimink School Board. And so I'm fairly familiar with how the school district does this thing. And as folks know, by and large, in order to increase property taxes, a school district has to go out to what's called a referendum and get the voters to approve the increase in tax rates. There's an exception for special education, and those costs, the school district has to pay them, but we don't have to ask voters to increase our special ed tax rate. But for operating for new construction, we do have to get a referendum passed in order to increase property taxes. So most years, other than the special ed rate, the tax rate for school districts is not going to be in question. There is language in the Delaware Code that gives the school districts the opportunity to increase their operating tax rate by up to 10%. And so it wouldn't be revenue neutral. It would actually result in an increase in revenue for school districts. I have long said and remain committed to opposing any attempt for our school district to do that. I'm only one of 5, so it doesn't mean that my view controls. But what I have pointed out to many is that any school district that attempts to use the reassessment as a way to avoid a referendum and just get a 10% increase in their property taxes from the reassessment, I suspect they would have a very difficult time ever passing another referendum, because I think by and large their constituents would be very upset if they tried to do it. So we'll see. I don't think school districts will take advantage of that because I don't think it works for them politically. But I as I say, I'm only one of 5 on my school board, and I can't speak for other school boards. And we're all waiting for the new assessment totals to shake out anyway. So.
And also by state law, the counties technically can increase taxes up to 15% as a result of a reassessment. Newcastle County Council had passed a resolution a while ago saying that they did not intend to raise taxes. Of course, it was only a resolution, and since that time, there are new folks in office, so we will see what happens there. I suspect that the inclination would be not to raise taxes, but again, they've got to see how everything shakes out with the reassessment, with the appeals, and the county's overall sort of financial condition at this point.
Yeah, but I will say that with respect to the counties who have the authority to increase taxes as a result of reassessment, they have the general authority to increase taxes anyway.
They do.
So the notion that, if it's a reassessment, they can increase up to 15%. They could increase by 15% any particular year they ever wanted.
Yeah.
So it's a little illusory or to suggest that the counties have that authority. School districts, you can avoid a referendum, and maybe that's attractive to some school districts. I think it would be a political mistake. But at least there, you do have a power that you don't have in any other year. So again, we'll see how it all plays out. That'll come later this spring and early summer.
Okay, next slide, please. So how does the appeal process work? I think Richard referenced earlier that there is actually a form that the counties use. They each have their own form. And that needs to be fully completed, signed, and submitted by the deadline. It does, in Newcastle County, for example, it does require very specific information about the property and also asks you to provide information as to comparables that you think are relevant with respect to the property in question. And I think we note this on a subsequent slide, but in Newcastle County, you can file your appeal by the 14th without having the appraisal as part of that, but the appraisal has to be submitted to Newcastle County no later than June 16th.
And so the good news there, again, there's no filing fee. But you can file your appeal. It has to be signed, it has to include certain information, but then you can file it with the understanding from with the county that you're going to get an appraisal and file the appraisal by the deadline. So it takes an appraiser 2 to 3 months. They're going to be busy, but that's more than enough time to meet the deadline if you get your appraiser started. And then if your appraisal comes back and it looks like it's the new assessed value is consistent with your appraisal, you can withdraw your appeal. You can dismiss it voluntarily if need be. So, there is that opportunity. If you're not sure and you haven't had much time to look at this, but you want to preserve your rights, you can file the appeal. You're going to have to hire an appraiser and have that appraiser then go through the process to determine a fair market value. But if that number comes back and, it may even be more than your assessed value, you could simply dismiss your appeal at that time. So Newcastle County, in that regard, I think, is acting in good faith. I mean, it knows that people haven't had a lot of time to look at these assessment numbers, relatively speaking. It knows the assessment process, the appraisal process can take a while. So they will let you come in, file your appeal. They'll have a certain amount of time to get an appraisal done and then proceed. I mean, then we give the appraisal to the county if we want to continue, and the county will review the appraisal. They may make a counter offer, but you don't have to have the full-blown appraisal in Newcastle County. Sussex County, which historically has only ever heard very few appeals in any given year, isn't quite so generous. But as we'll talk about more in a second, they do require you to provide a lot more information up front with your appeal. Cost evidence, rent evidence, stuff like that. It's all exempt from FOIA because it'll be considered confidential business information. But the Sussex County forms are more intensive in terms of the information requirements than Newcastle County.
In terms of the appeal process, so both counties are planning to use referees. Those individuals would meet with appellants and see if the matter can be resolved at that level. If it cannot be resolved at that level, then an administrative hearing would be scheduled before the Board of Assessment Review. I noticed on the county's website, they are currently actively recruiting folks to serve in the capacity of referees. And I do know from speaking to the county that they are expecting a lot of appeals to be filed. Once the decision has been made by the Board of Assessment Review, that decision can be appealed to Superior Court. That appeal is on the record that is made before the Board of Assessment Review. Next slide, please. So with respect to the appeals, the information a property owner can present is limited to information such as comparable sales and other information contained in the appeal form itself. If you don't provide the information with outside of an appraisal, which in Newcastle County, you're getting some additional time to provide that. But you're basically limited to what you're submitting as part of your appeal form. And as I indicated previously, in Newcastle County, you have until June 16th to file the appraisal with the county. And under circumstances perhaps beyond your control, the chair of the Assessment Review Board can grant an extension in terms of submitting that information up to 1 year. But it, again, is circumstances that are sort of beyond your control.
Well, I mean, the next slide just shows you, can we just go to the next slide real quick? The next slide shows you links to where the forms are for Newcastle County and Sussex County. And as I have said, the Sussex County form for non-residential also includes an income expense form for every appeal. By the way, these links are for non-residential. There is a separate form for residential that's a little more detailed. And what happens in these forms, I mean, it asks you for your witnesses that you would intend to call and certain other specific information. And the county can be fairly ruthless about limiting you to the information contained in your appeal form, other than, of course, the appraisal itself. For commercial property owners, you're going to be relying in all likelihood on your appraisal. So it's not quite as much a handicap as it might otherwise be. But for residential property owners, you're not going to get an appraisal necessarily. And the form is more detailed. It asks you for comparable sales and it asks you for other information. And if you, when you get to the board hearing, if you want to list some other comparables that weren't on your form, the board will probably exclude those comparables since they weren't part of your appeal form. That's on the residential side. So it can be challenging sometimes for residential property owners to appeal their assessment because, you know, it's hard for them to find comparables. Ordinarily, you know, if you're friends with a real estate agent or somebody who can help you find those comparables, that's probably the best way to complete that form. Pam, did you want to move to the next slide or you have more on this?
No, next slide. Next slide, yours.
So we have two slides here back to back. The first is how does one determine assessed value? I'm going to talk about, again, an emphasis on, I'll say, non-residential property. For non-residential property, as we've talked about, your assessment is fair market value in Newcastle County, fair market value as of July 1, 2024, in Sussex, July 1, 2023. And fair market value is the price a willing buyer would pay a willing seller with neither party being under any compulsion to sell. And, you know, we've got a case pending right now in a condemnation setting, but I mean, also the question there, fair market value. And, you know, the case law is replete with statements and emphasis that anything a willing seller would emphasize about a property to, I'll say, increase its value is fair game in figuring out what fair market value is. And so, you know, if in addition to having an office or a building, you've also got a billboard, for example, that's kind of a premium, so maybe you pay more. You know, if you have property and somebody's paying you for, you know, an annual fee for an easement, a cell tower, for example, that's something that would affect fair market value if you were selling the property. And so that's kind of a little premium that would increase fair market value. Delaware courts are very clear that one takes into account all factors affecting the property itself. And so, for example, we had a case years ago when the 300 Delaware Avenue building was first constructed. The bank at the time that was the tenant signed a very long-term lease where it was paying only, I think, $2 a square foot to start, and it gradually increased to $4 a square foot. And that may have been market may have actually been even below market when signed. But 20 years later, it was multiples below market. And the answer was that affected the fair market value of the property significantly. And so there was a large reduction in the assessed value for that property. We had another property that needed millions of dollars worth of asbestos abatement. And so you couldn't just value the property based on its, its tenants or its rental rates or anything like that. And again, the court said, yes, this is something that affects the fair market value of the property, and so it's properly considered in determining the assessment. And so the obvious problem that's presented here is that Tyler Technologies, they're doing a mass appraisal. And so they're trying to value, there's over 200,000 parcels in Newcastle County. They're not doing individual appraisals of all those parcels. So, they determine kind of what they consider to be the market data in terms of rents, vacancy rate, expenses, all those sorts of things. And then based on what they know about the property in the county records, its actual square footage, and things like that, it will determine and will tell you what your assessed value is. But they don't necessarily know what your actual rental rates are or how long the leases are. They don't know your actual vacancy rate. They don't know if the building is kind of at the end of its useful life and will need major upgrades to building systems. And they certainly don't know about environmental constraints, floodplain, wetlands, and things like that. Recently, we represented a golf course about 3 years ago. COVID time is funny. The vast majority of the golf course is in a floodplain. And the county had assessed it as if it was not, as if the ground was fully developable. And so we went into the county, had an appraisal that demonstrated that a golf course was essentially the highest and best use for the property because you couldn't build any structures in it due to the floodplain and the wetlands and that sort of thing. But the county had severely overassessed the property. And so we were able to persuade the county to dramatically reduce the assessed value. I will say, unfortunately, it seems as though all of that information we provided the county just 2 years ago went into some black hole somewhere because the Tyler Technologies, again, is assessing or proposing to assess that golf course as if it was fully developable. So, we'll have to work that out. That's just one of many examples of, I'll say the imprecision associated with a mass appraisal. Now, I don't want to beat up Tyler too much. I mean, it's a daunting job to try to assess over 200,000 parcels, and you can't be expected to get them all spot on or accurate, which is why we have this appeal process. I would say with the golf course, if the county had that information on record, why didn't they use it? But that's just one extreme example. I do think that the county and Tyler depends to a certain extent on property owners to come in and point out where the errors are. And so to a certain extent, they're relying on the appeal process just as much as anybody else. I mean, remember, the county's job is to assess property at its fair market value as of July 1, 2024. And I'm talking about Newcastle County now, Sussex, July 1, 2023. And if you can come in with solid evidence that demonstrates that, based on the more general market information they used, they overassessed your property. I mean, the county will, it should test it, but then it should eventually say, yeah, okay, we've tested your data, it makes sense, and they should accept it. And their bias is going to be obviously to defend their work product, but that's not always the case. I mean, there are times when you submit your information and you don't even have to go to the Board of Assessment Review. The county will agree with you, or they'll say, well, we agree with most of what you're saying, and you can work out a settlement. And then there are times when it's a closer call and the county believes what it did was right, even after reviewing your appraisal. And so then you'll go to a hearing. In this case, because of the volume that's going to of appeals, they are going to have referees. And then if you're not satisfied with the referee's recommendation, you'll still get a full-blown hearing. If they get as many appeals as they're anticipating, it's going to be a while before this thing all shakes out once and for all. And so you may easily be getting tax bills based on your current proposed assessment. And if that happens to you and you've got an appeal pending and the tax bill comes in the meantime, we can talk to you about how to handle that. But if you do overpay your taxes or you pay your tax bill as it comes in and the assessment is later reduced, county will give you a credit on future tax bills. And so that has happened from time to time. Famously in the 1990s, when GM was still located in Newport, they had a property tax appeal that took several years to resolve, but also resulted in a very substantial reduction. And the credits they got going forward, I don't think they had to pay taxes for like 2 or 3 years. That's how much their overpayments were, which then had ripple effects on Red Clay School District because suddenly this big chunk of revenue wasn't coming in anymore. Anyway, that's just a sad story.
We had a question,
Okay.
and this goes back a few slides, but so the question is, on average, if your original assessed value was $1 million, the taxes were $38,000, as you had talked about. If the new assessed value is $5 million, then one might expect an approximate new tax bill of $50,655. This would be a 33% increase on a specific property. Is there a per property cap on the increase? In the example above, the increase of 5 times exceeds the 375% average, hence the 33% increase.
No, and that math works. And there is no cap on any increase for an individual property. And so the rule of thumb that I'll say the literature of mass appraisals tells you, the rule of thumb that Tyler Technologies will tell you is that as part of any reassessment, roughly 1/3 of property owners will have to pay more. Roughly 1/3 of property owners will pay less. And then basically roughly 1/3 of property owners will pay about the same. But there's no caps. And obviously there wouldn't be a cap on any increase, because if you did that, then you'd have to have a cap on the amount of any decrease as well. And you'd have some property owners paying more in property taxes than their assessment would indicate. So, I mean, the answer is there is no cap. And again, remember, the purpose of assessments themselves is apportionment. So, let's say Newcastle County needs $100 million, and we're going to pay based on everybody's relative property value. So if my property is worth twice as much as your property, then in theory, I should pay twice as much in property taxes as you do. That's really what the assessment process is designed to do. What's everybody's fair share of the overall taxes that need to be raised? But getting to the answer to that specific question, if your property assessment goes up more than 3.75%, there is no cap on the increased taxes that you're going to have to pay. And in my own, with respect to my house down south of the canal, it's always been a little underassessed. But with the new assessed value, I'm going up like 5.8 times, 580%. And so I know my tax bill is going to go up as a result. I look at the number they've given me, and I can't really complain about it too much. It seems about right. So it's just, some people pay more, some people pay less, some people pay about the same.
Okay, next slide, please. So how does one not determine assessed value? So the county is pretty strict about what evidence they're going to accept for valuation. You can't cite to them other assessed values. So, for example, if you live in a community and you notice that others within the community with similar house has a different assessment than you, a lesser assessment, they are not going to accept that as a basis for how they should value your property. Um, Not saying we agree with that, simply saying that that has been what they have determined over time. The list price for properties currently on the market also is not something that the county will accept as the basis for valuation. And third, condemnation sales and transactions made under threat of condemnation. That valuation is not going to be acceptable. That is the case even if the parties essentially agreed. So for example, if Del Dot's going to take your property, and this is more in the commercial context, but if Del Dot wants to take your property, they've made an offer to you, you found that to be acceptable, and you say, great, I'm going to take that, fine, we're done. That is still not going to be accepted. And the courts have made this ruling that is still not going to be acceptable in terms of the valuation of the property. And also, whatever Zillow was saying in terms of the valuation of the property, that is not going to be acceptable to the county. So again, you're going to have acceptable data analysis, basically comparable sales if you're talking about residential properties. Obviously, there are other methodologies as you're talking about commercial properties.
Right, and so the point of the second big bullet on this slide, it says the foregoing might suggest to you that your property is overassessed. I mean, if you look across the street and to your right and left in your neighborhood and you're like, geez, everybody else has lower assessments than me, and I've got the exact same, model house, and, so that might tell you you are overassessed, but the county is not going to accept other assessments. It's going to want you to have comparable sales. I will say, as Pam indicated, I mean, it is what it is, and that's the rule, but I do think it's a little unfair because if the county is taking the position that the assessment on everybody's property is fair market value as of the date, then how can the county be heard to complain if someone says, you said my neighbor's house was worth X, but you say my house is worth Y. If you think X is the fair market value of my neighbor's house, and I think the two houses are the same, then why is it mine worth X? I do think you should be allowed to make that observation and make that point, but that's not the rule. You're not allowed to do that, and that remains the rule. So, and Zillow, of course, I mean, is always kind of interesting the way they do things, I guess. But those are the rules. You need actual comparables of sales. You need actual data. And we did get a follow-up question to our point about the increase, which was, is there, 3.75, 3.8 was what folks are saying in Newcastle County right now. But is there a breakdown between residential and commercial? I don't think, so far as I know, the answer to that is no. Certainly, no one from the county has suggested or indicated what that might be. I think that in the case of commercial properties, I'm aware of some that have gone up, I'll say dramatically, but I'm also aware of others that haven't gone up to 3.75%. So I think, just like everybody else, there are going to be some commercial, office, industrial properties that are going to end up paying more, but I'm aware of at least a couple that are in all likelihood going to be going up less, or their tax bill, I'm sorry, will actually go down as a result of the reassessment.
The other question is, if the new tax amount due increases substantially, will there be a phase-in of the amount due? No.
No, I mean, there's been no talk of that. And again, getting back to the point I made from a theoretical point of view, assessment is about what everybody's share should be. So if your share goes up dramatically, you're just going to have to pay it. I mean, maybe you could call the county and try to work out some sort of hardship claim. County will probably want interest because that's what happens if you don't pay your bill in full anyway. I mean, there's an
And a
interest,
penalty.
and right, and there's also a penalty. No one has suggested that the normal rules won't apply going forward.
And an additional question, I have an appraisal from September of 2024, which was done for a bank refinance. Will Newcastle County accept this as an appraisal, or does it need to be updated? I know that the rules provide that the board will only consider an appraisal report prepared within 1 year before the date of the most recent assessment base year. So under that, the 9/24.
Well, you're going to want your appraiser. I mean, I think you can use that appraisal, but you're
Yeah.
going to want him to prepare kind of a supplemental report. It may only be a page or two,
Right.
maybe 5, but where that appraiser says, last September, I gave the property a fair market value as of September 1st, 2024 of $10 million. For assessment purposes with the July 1, 2024 date, I would estimate the fair market value was, $9,985,000 or whatever. But the evidence that you present all has to relate to fair market value as of July 1, 2024. So, if you come in with an appraisal that says the fair market value on July 1, 2022, or September 15th, 2023, or April 1st, 2024, it might suggest that you're overassessed, but it's not going to carry the day, because as the appellant, and the burden will be on you to show the county's assessed value is wrong, you're going to need to tell the Board of Assessment Review, or you're going to need to tell the county, this is what the fair market value was as of July 1, 2024 for Newcastle County, 2023 for Sussex County.
All right, next slide, please.
For those of you who don't do a lot of appraisal work, this slide is how does one determine assessed value. And there are 3 generally accepted methods. The income approach for income producing property like shopping centers, apartments, office buildings. You look at the rentals, you subtract the costs, and figure out a net cash flow and capitalize that. And that's generally considered the best approach. Ordinarily, appraisers will also supplement or check that value by looking at comparable sales of other office buildings or other shopping centers, although that can sometimes be difficult to do. And then you've also got the construction cost or construction approach, where you look at how much it would cost if you had to replicate the building. And I mean, that's actually, you can do that with some rigor, because there is a outfit it's the Marshall Valuation Service that studies construction costs by year, and they can tell you how much copper pipe cost in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. I mean, they've got all that data, and it's even computerized now, where you can plug in the information about your building and the assumptions about it, and it'll spit out a estimated cost. And then as part of that, if your building's 20 years old, it'll also factor in the depreciation for everything. So it figures out the value with depreciation and all that, I'll say, sort of stuff. And so most appraisals will look, depending on the type of property, at least 2, ordinarily all 3 if they can. There are other approaches to value that can be followed as well. And Delaware courts have said that generally accepted valuation methods, even if they're not one of what I'll call the big 3, may be considered if they're generally accepted in the marketplace. And so, for example, I mentioned billboards earlier. One of the methods that people value billboard locations and billboard spots on, you just take gross revenue and multiply it by a number that happens to be in vogue for that year or that time period. And that gives you a rough estimate of value. not as good as the income approach, but it's another method of value that is generally accepted in the marketplace. So again, if you're getting an appraisal, which is what my advice would be to anybody who's serious about a commercial or industrial or office property, your appraiser will take all of this stuff into account and produce a report for you.
Next slide, and I believe this is our last slide.
So this slide is the name of a case that just came out earlier this month on February 11th, CCD Senior Living LLC. And in this case, do it yourself isn't always the best way to do things. Because what happened here was a property owner or property owners, related entities that owned a number of properties, filed a number of appeals with the board. The appeals lacked data, and they didn't ask for an appraisal. They didn't provide any comparables in their initial filing. They provided some cost income data, but not a lot. And they showed up at the hearing represented by a non-attorney who was a third party. And, the board, the county, I think, took the right approach, or, you can say it was aggressive, but I mean, under the rules, the county said, and the board agreed that, look, there's just insufficient data here. They didn't give us what we really need. They never asked if they could submit appraisals for these properties. And based on this insufficient data, lack of real data of substantial overvaluation, the county argued that the appellant or appellants failed to prove their case. And in addition to the lack of data, the county also said, and this is in the rules, that you cannot, if you're a property owner, you can represent yourself. And if you're an LLC or a corporation, you can represent yourself as long as the person who's representing you is a member of the LLC or the corporation. Otherwise, if you want to have a third party that not the property owner or an employee or member of the property owner, you've got to be represented by an attorney. That's in the board's rules, and that was one of the reasons why this case was dismissed, because they had the appellants had a property management company that was purporting to represent them before the board. And so, in addition to lack of data, the board said, we can't have non-attorneys appearing in front of us. Look at our rules. So with that, it is 12:58. We're almost out of time. Do we have any more? We'll take more questions.
Right, of course. Do not have any more questions at the moment. But certainly our information was provided, and we will circulate the PowerPoint that was done along with the recording of the presentation to those who had signed up today, so that you can have that information and certainly know how to reach us.
All right, so the pop quiz, you can go back to camera so people can look at us, or maybe they don't want to look at us, I don't know.
Yeah, the pop quiz.
But pop quiz, what is the appeal deadline for Newcastle County? Okay, I'm going to give you 10 seconds. It's March 14th. And the appeal deadline for Sussex County, which requires a lot more information than Newcastle County, is March 31st. And by the way, while we were on our PowerPoint presentations, we were joined by someone from our offices, Eleanor Lee. So that's the third person you now see on the screen. Pam and I are both available if you want to email us or call us, and we can help you. And I will say or ask, if you are thinking about filing an appeal, please don't wait until March 12th or 11th. I mean, email us this weekend, email us next week, so we can at least get the process started. We will need original signatures, and they need to get to the county offices no later than 4 p.m. And you don't want to be there at 3:58 and suddenly find someone's locked the doors early. So many, many, many years ago, when there was a bad snowstorm the week of March 12th or 13th, I forget what day it was, Monday of that week. The county was shut down, the state was shut down for a day or two. It reopened on the 14th. There was no time deadline at the time. One set of appeals was delivered to the county offices, and the county refused to accept them, saying it was after 4 o'clock, even though their rules didn't say you had to be there by 4 o'clock. That's why that time deadline is there now. But the court said, look, they got them there. It was extraordinary circumstances with the weather. You should have accepted them since you didn't say you wouldn't. And the county was ordered to accept them, and then there was a reduction. So happy ending for the property owner. But again, now the rules are firm, they're in place, and if you miss that deadline, you're out of luck. You're going to have to pay this year's bill. You can always appeal next year. Every year you can always appeal again. Even if you lose this year, you can appeal again next year. You can appeal again next year. You can appeal again next year. Presumably, as you make subsequent appeals, you'll have more information on the theory that if I didn't persuade them last year, but I give them more, maybe I'll persuade them this year. So you can appeal every year, and if you miss this deadline, you're not stuck for eternity, but you are stuck for this coming tax year. So again, the appeal deadlines, March 14th for Newcastle County, March 31st for Sussex County. And Pam, did you have anything else?
Nope, thank you, appreciate it, and we will get the email out with the follow-up information, and in the meantime, if you have any follow-up questions for us, you can certainly send us emails or reach out directly. So thanks very much. Happy Friday, everyone.